At 0720 hours on the morning of October 18, 1944, Obergefreiter Martin Keller emerged from a cattle car onto a railway siding in Lincolnshire. A cold English drizzle greeted him, mingling with the grime of a 3-day journey that caked his Wehrmacht uniform. He was one of 180 men, remnants of the 352nd Infantry Division shattered during the collapse at Falaise, now forming ragged lines under a grey sky. For years, Nazi propaganda had hammered home a single, terrifying message. The British Empire was built on colonial brutality and would show no mercy. The broadcasts from Berlin were unequivocal. Starvation rations, forced labor, and summary execution awaited any German soldier in captivity. It was better, they had been told, to die fighting. Keller scanned the scene, bracing for the savagery he had been promised. He found none. In its place was an unnerving order. British soldiers stood in immaculate formations, their uniforms pressed despite the damp, their rifles held with practiced precision. There was no shouting, no chaotic violence, only a quiet, professional discipline that reminded Keller, uncomfortably, of German peacetime standards his own division had long since abandoned in the desperate retreat across France. A middle-aged British sergeant approached, his steady gaze that of a veteran who had witnessed the full spectrum of war. In heavily accented but comprehensible German, he issued his commands. You will form orderly lines. You will be searched, you will then receive water. The tone was neither cruel nor kind. It was the dispassionate, matter-of-fact address of one soldier to another. Almost involuntarily, Keller found himself nodding in compliance. The subsequent search was thorough but efficient, devoid of humiliation. Personal effects were catalogued, not plundered. The wounded were immediately separated for medical care. Then, British soldiers moved down the lines with canteens. As one of them handed Keller a tin mug of cold, clean water, he spoke with an almost apologetic air. "Sorry about the wait," the young man said. "There's tea at the camp." Tea. The word hung in the damp air, a symbol of a mundane civility so profoundly at odds with the brutal reality Keller had been conditioned to expect, it felt like a message from another world. By the autumn of 1944, Britain had become an unlikely jailer to the Third Reich, responsible for a staggering 400,000 Axis prisoners captured in North Africa, Italy, and after D-Day. For these men, the reality of their captivity would shatter years of carefully constructed propaganda. A vast archipelago of containment stretched the length of the nation, from Cornwall to Scotland, comprising over 600 prefabricated compounds behind barbed wire and watchtowers. These camps operated not on cruelty, but on a highly organized system of decency, mandated from the very top by the War Office. This policy was an explicit adherence to the Geneva Conventions, an approach born not of sentiment, but of a cold, strategic calculus. First, security. Well-treated prisoners were far less likely to riot or attempt mass escapes. Second, intelligence. Cooperative prisoners could provide invaluable information on German morale and defenses. Third, diplomacy. Humane conditions were a crucial lever to ensure reciprocal treatment for British POWs in enemy hands. Finally, there was a moral imperative. In a war against barbarism, Britain was determined to prove which side represented genuine civilized values. The documented statistics tell the true story. An average daily ration of 2,900 calories often surpassed that of British civilians. Every camp had at least a basic infirmary, contributing to a mortality rate lower than the general population. Of the 380,000 prisoners assigned to agricultural or reconstruction labor, recorded successful escapes were negligible. This was a systematic, documented policy of care, one that ensured German prisoners in Britain would survive the war. On October 19, Martin Keller's transport arrived at Camp 174 in Lanarkshire, a facility that would forge memories shaping post-war German attitudes. Before the prisoners stood a meticulously ordered world, wooden barracks for 2,000 men, arranged in precise rows, all enclosed by double-barbed wire fencing and watched over by 8 guard towers. The intake procedure was a study in systematic control. Documentation was completed in German by British clerks specifically trained in the language for POW administration. Medical examinations were conducted by army doctors who approached their task with the same professional detachment afforded to their own soldiers. The camp rules were explained with unambiguous clarity. This was not improvised captivity. It was industrial-scale imprisonment, executed with a characteristic British organizational competence that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. The true psychological dislocation, however, occurred in the mess hall. Conditioned by propaganda to expect starvation rations, Keller was instead presented with a substantial meal: real bread, not the sawdust substitute of the front, a stew with discernible chunks of meat, boiled potatoes, margarine, and tea. It was more food than his unit had seen in the final, desperate weeks of fighting in Normandy. Around him, other prisoners ate in a similar state of stunned silence. Some savored each bite, while others devoured their food with a desperate urgency, as if it might be snatched away. A few wept, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of a full stomach. "I couldn't understand it," Martin recalled in a 1986 interview. "We'd been told the British would treat us worse than animals. Instead, the first night we received proper food, slept in dry barracks, and weren't beaten." The chasm between expectation and reality was so profound that many prisoners believed it was a temporary deception, a prelude to the real brutality they had been promised would come. For the German prisoners arriving at facilities like Camp 174, the anticipated campaign of brutalization never came. The camp's regulations were stringent, yet they were applied with an unwavering impartiality to all prisoners, regardless of rank or unit. There was no arbitrary cruelty dictated by a guard's mood. This ethos was instilled in new personnel by Sergeant Major William Thompson, who explained the guiding philosophy with stark clarity: "These men were our enemies. They fought for Hitler, killed our mates, bombed our cities, but they're prisoners now, which means they're our responsibility. We don't abuse them because we're not savages. We maintain order through discipline and fairness. That's the British way. We don't need to beat men to show we've beaten them. The barbed wire does that." This disciplined restraint was a deliberate act of ideological warfare, standing in absolute and intentional contrast to the horrific German treatment of Soviet prisoners. It was a demonstration that a democratic civilization could maintain its moral standards under the pressures of war, directly refuting Nazi claims that democracies were inherently weak and decadent. This policy found practical expression in labor. German prisoners were assigned to work, primarily in agriculture, which was legal under the Geneva Conventions and desperately needed by Britain's war-strained economy. With millions of British men in uniform, farms lacked workers for harvests and roads needed repair. The human reality of this system is captured in the experience of Martin Keller, a former bank clerk, assigned to a farm in Kent in December 1944. He worked alongside 15 other prisoners, supervised by a British farmer, Robert Harrison, who had lost his own son at Dunkirk. "We harvested crops, repaired fences, helped with livestock," Keller recalled. Harrison was stern, but fair. He showed us how to do tasks properly, but he also brought us tea during breaks and never raised his hand to anyone. It was a simple but profound contract, summarized by Keller as honest work for honest treatment. Across the British countryside, this vast labor program fostered unexpected and complex human interactions. Initial hostility from farmers frequently gave way to a grudging respect for the prisoners who worked diligently in their fields. Through daily contact with supervisors, some Germans learned the rudiments of English, while occasional gestures of kindness from civilians, a shared cigarette or an extra food ration, served as small but potent contradictions to the official propaganda about British hatred. The nuance of this relationship was captured decades later by a farmer named Harrison. In a 1979 interview, his memory was vivid. "They were just lads, really, scared, far from home, doing what they'd been told. My boy David died fighting their army, but these particular men hadn't killed him. Hating them wouldn't bring David back." His resolution was a pragmatic one: "I worked them hard, but treated them fair. That's all you can do, isn't it? Be decent when you can." Harrison's farm was just one of thousands participating in an operation of staggering scale. Prisoner labor was utilized on approximately 380,000 farms across England, Scotland, and Wales. For 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, these men harvested potatoes, wheat, and sugar beets, and worked on infrastructure projects from road repair to forestry. For their efforts, they received an additional 400 calories in daily rations and small wages, credited to accounts for their eventual post-war repatriation. Yet amid this massive logistical undertaking, the most profound symbol of humane treatment proved to be something utterly routine: the tea break. Every morning and afternoon, British supervisors would brew and distribute tea to the German prisoners, exactly as they would to their own countrymen. For the British, it was an unremarkable habit. For the Germans, it was revolutionary. Tea wasn't merely a beverage, it was a cultural statement. To be offered tea was to be treated not as a subhuman enemy, but as a person worthy of basic courtesy. Former prisoner Martin Keller never forgot his first tea break. Harrison called us over, poured tea from a thermos, handed me a cup, he recalled. No ceremony, no speech. I stood there holding this cup of tea, and realized he was treating us the same way he'd treat English workers. Not friends. We'd never be friends, but equals in that moment. Human beings taking a break. For the prisoners, the simple, routine acts of their captors were what most effectively dismantled the stereotypes of British cruelty they had been taught to believe. The daily tea break, a gesture of casual normalcy, became imbued with profound symbolism. It represented a fundamental decency, an extension of courtesy to a defeated enemy that was more powerful than any formal propaganda. Because the guards and supervisors offered it as pure routine, it felt authentic. As one prisoner observed in a censored letter, the British give us tea, real tea, twice daily. They share it without hesitation as though we're workers rather than enemies. I cannot explain what this means. It tells me everything I was taught about British cruelty was lies. This quiet counter-narrative of humanity was even more pronounced within the camp's medical facilities. At Camp 124, wounded and sick Germans were treated by British Army doctors and nurses with the identical professional standards applied to their own soldiers. The case of a prisoner named Martin during the harsh winter of January 1945 provides a stark illustration. Stricken with pneumonia, he was placed under the care of the camp medical officer, Captain James Walsh, who prescribed sulfur drugs and extra rations. His recovery was monitored by Sister Margaret Downing, a British nurse who, as Martin later discovered, had lost her own brother to German artillery fire. Yet, she treated her enemy patient with complete professionalism, checking his temperature and administering medication without a hint of coldness. When a recovered Martin tried to thank her, she replied simply, "You're welcome. Stay healthy." While this systematic care certainly served British interests by keeping the prisoner workforce effective, its true impact was ideological. It demonstrated that Britain valued human life, even that of an enemy soldier, a distinction that mattered deeply to men who had been told they were facing a merciless foe. In the final, bitter winter of the war, an incident in a British prisoner of war camp would crystallize a policy that stood in stark contrast to the casual cruelty often associated with empire. In December 1944, camp authorities permitted German prisoners to organize their own Christmas services, both Protestant and Catholic. Within a barracks decorated with improvised ornaments fashioned from scrap materials, the men gathered for religious observance. On Christmas Eve, as the Protestant prisoners began to sing Still Nacht Silent Night, the traditional hymn drifted across the compound on the cold air, reaching the British guards on watch. The guards fell silent, listening intently. When the song ended, several applauded softly. Shortly after, a Sergeant Thompson entered the barracks carrying cigarettes and biscuits. These were not required by regulations but were offered as a simple gesture of common humanity during the holiday. "Happy Christmas, lads," he said, distributing the items before leaving. For one prisoner, Martin, the moment was a revelation. "We were singing about peace and hope while imprisoned by enemies we tried to kill," he later recalled. The British guards could have mocked us. Instead, they respected it. Thompson's act transcended the enmity of war, revealing that their captors were not the barbarians of Nazi propaganda, but civilized men treating a defeated enemy with a dignity they themselves had rarely shown. This policy, maintaining security and discipline while recognizing the prisoner's humanity, had a powerful secondary effect. Letters home, describing fair treatment and adequate food, became instruments of propaganda collapse. As Martin wrote to his wife that December, "The British treat us fairly. Everything we were told about British cruelty was propaganda. Do not believe what you hear from Berlin." For families in Germany, such dispatches from captured loved ones systematically undermined the regime's frantic pronouncements. From the ruins of bombed-out Hamburg, a letter from a prisoner of war could travel with explosive force. When a soldier's wife shared his account of decent treatment with her neighbors, the information rippled outward, creating a powerful undercurrent of doubt. If Nazi propaganda about Allied cruelty was a lie, what else was false? The promised miracle weapons, the claims of imminent victory, the very justification for continuing a hopeless war, all were called into question. British authorities understood the immense strategic value of these letters. While subject to censorship, they served as a vital intelligence source on German civilian morale, and more importantly, as a highly effective tool of psychological warfare. A simple, personal account from a German soldier confirming his survival and humane treatment could undermine the Reich's narrative more effectively than any Allied broadcast. This profound disillusionment often began inside the wire fences of the camps themselves. For many prisoners, extended captivity instigated a gradual but powerful ideological transformation. The initial shock at receiving fair treatment from their British captors slowly chipped away at the bedrock of Nazi doctrine. If the enemy wasn't the monster Goebbels had described, then perhaps the regime's other foundational claims, its racial theories, its conspiracies, were also lies. As a prisoner named Martin recalled of his evolution, "In the camp, I had time to think without constant propaganda. I saw the British treating us fairly despite having every reason to hate us. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my understanding. The British who defeated and imprisoned me were more honorable than the regime I'd served." Later, British authorities would implement formal re-education programs, using lectures, films, and discussions to expose Nazi crimes and promote democratic principles. Yet for many, the most significant conversion had already occurred, sparked not by a curriculum, but by the stark contrast between their experience of British fairness and their memories of the regime's brutality. The transformation was by no means universal. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis to the end, while others became cynical about all ideology. Nevertheless, a significant number used their captivity as an opportunity for genuine intellectual and moral reconstruction, emerging from the war with their entire worldview reshaped. Beginning in 1946, as the immense task of post-war reconstruction loomed, a remarkable chapter in Anglo-German relations began to unfold. Great Britain, grappling with severe labor shortages, turned to an unlikely source: the thousands of German prisoners of war still held on its soil. When offered the chance to stay on as civilian workers, approximately 25,000 men volunteered through 1948, trading their prison camps for civilian housing and hostels. They were put to work on farms and reconstruction projects, rebuilding the very nation they had once fought against. For men like Martin Keller, the decision was born from grim necessity. "I had nothing to return to," he would later recall. "Hamburg was rubble. My family scattered or dead. Britain offered work, and the possibility of rebuilding a life." This sentiment was widespread. The fair treatment they had received as prisoners fostered a sense of trust, suggesting a future as workers was possible. This policy of voluntary retention became an extraordinary social experiment. It demonstrated that humane conduct could foster cooperation, transforming former enemies into willing partners in Britain's recovery. For some, the stay became permanent. They married British women, established new lives, and became citizens, their children and grandchildren growing up British, heirs to a complex legacy. In March, at a railway station near the closing Lanascher camp, this chapter drew to a close for Martin. 3.5 years earlier, he had arrived on this same platform as a captive, steeling himself for brutality. Now, he stood a free man, with British work references and his savings. The farmer who had been his supervisor, Robert Harrison, had come to see him off. As they shook hands, Harrison passed him a small package: tea, biscuits, and a letter. "You're a good worker, Martin," he said. "If Germany doesn't treat you right, you're welcome back here." Martin, unable to speak, could only nod. He had arrived expecting punishment but had been offered tea. He had anticipated cruelty but had found a quiet decency. As the train pulled away, carrying him past the rolling English fields, he reflected on a truth so unexpected it had rebuilt him from the inside out. Years later, in the rebuilt city of Hamburg, a former bank clerk named Martin would tell his children stories of the country that had once imprisoned him. His memories were not of a nation that had broken him, but one that had, paradoxically, shown him a different path. He spoke not of cruelty or revenge, but of the small, disarming rituals of captivity. The shared tea breaks, the observance of Christmas services, the quiet fairness of farmers who had lost their own sons in the fighting. He recalled the nurses who, despite their own personal losses, worked to save German lives with professional resolve. For Martin, these experiences coalesced into a profound revelation. They taught me what civilization means, he would recall, not through propaganda, but through their treatment of a defeated enemy. The German prisoners, conditioned by a brutal ideology, had arrived on British soil expecting punishment they felt they deserved. Instead, they were met with a startling decency. This restraint, this fundamental humanity extended even to a hated foe, represented a form of strength Germany had forgotten. That grey English morning, when men braced for retribution and were instead offered a cup of tea, became a quiet testament to the resilience of civilized values. Britain's handling of its 400,000 enemy prisoners proved a powerful point, that even in a total war against a nihilistic regime, a nation could uphold its principles. The weatherproof barracks, adequate rations, and access to medical care were more than logistics, they were a demonstration. For thousands of German soldiers who anticipated starvation but received food, who feared beatings but found fairness, British captivity became their first encounter with a functioning democracy. It was a lesson that victory does not require vengeance, and that true strength is measured not in the capacity for cruelty, but in an unshakable commitment to decency.